fascist demonstrations. We held our own anti-fascist meetings. But I felt at the time that it was inadequate. What we were doing had no real meaning, and that the struggle was a struggle in space. That was the acid test of whether fascism was going to become a far stronger force or whether it could be defeated.
So you were, I mean, it was...
I was very frustrated with what we were doing. I don't think it was sufficient. And so I thought I'd apply to go. I saw Mick Jenkins, as the fellow mentioned, and got refused because of no military knowledge. And then as things got a bit tighter, I got the okay to go.
What were the CP's grounds for accepting people to go? I mean, I was reading Walter Gregory's book, but you had to be over 21, he said.
Yes,
Nottingham and not married or something.
Some people from North Manchester Challenge went, who were younger, under 21, they were sent back when they finally got there. Alec Armstrong, Fred Killick, Vic Shammer, Alec Armstrong were killed. Went over before me to Spain and they were killed. I was very frustrated with what we were doing.
Sorry about that.
I was a keen anti-fascist, you know, very keen. I wasn't political more than really anti-fascist, not political, you know, and you know, a trade union point of view mostly, you know, militant trade unionist. Although I was in the party, I was mainly a militant trade unionist, you know, with an anti-fascist, a keen anti-fascist outlook.
So these are the three veterans who fought and survived, and we're really going to go into the story through their experiences, which I think are sort of fairly incredible, and I want to look at their motivations for going, how they got there, and what happened there. And I'm also going to talk about Sam Wilde, whose interviews I've listened to at the Working Class Movement Library, and I'll be quoting from them. Now, it's very difficult. I want to sort of say something really, I suppose I should, about the background to the Spanish Civil War without giving a history lesson. And my apologies to some people if I assume too much or if I assume too little. But I mean, the first excerpt, Benny Goldman, he was a young Jewish lad, 18 years of age, lied about his age and went. A quite high relative proportion of young men that went were actually Jewish from Britain and also from America. I think I read the other day that 30% of the American volunteers were Jewish. And there's the kind of, you really have to look at the whole thing in the context of the situation. Spain, the Republic in 1931, the Second Republic, was always brittle, was always fragile. Spain is a polarized society. It is politically violent, had been for some time. Both the left and the right thought that the Republic belonged to them. And when the first government is elected in 31, the anarchists are, and anarchism has deep roots in Spain. It arrived in Spain before socialism did. It's not as we see it or as we think of it in Britain or anywhere else, really. It really is grounded. It's got a trades union. It is armed, actually. And it has a lot of support in Catalonia, the most advanced industrial region, and also a lot of support in Andalusia, which is one of the poorest agrarian regions at the time. And they're excluded from government and they confront the Republic very, very early on. In 1933, an election, the right wins, the left one accepts it. They confront it. There was a violent miners' strike in Asturias in 1934. And in fact, the front page of the Daily Worker in 1934 says, "Civil war in Spain." People thought that the violence around that strike, which involved 2,000 people killed, 30 to 40,000 miners arrested, and who leads the repression of that strike but General Franco? And the Spanish Civil War, in some senses, was awaited, was predicted. So in 1936, there is an election. The Popular Front government win it narrowly. There was a Popular Front government already in existence in briefly in France, and the right decide that the election is illegitimate, basically. And there's a pattern in Spain, really, of people really refusing to accept election results, and there is a rising. And the International Brigade are not the first people to go and fight for the Republic from abroad in Spain at all. In fact, people are already arriving very early on, shortly after the rising by Franco. The Spanish government, the Republican government, considers an international column. They decide not to do that because they don't think the soldiers will be trained. And then in September of 1936, the Comintern, the Communist International, really the Soviet international organization, organizes international brigades and asks for people to fight for the Republic. I skipped through that, but one has to, because I want to hear more from these guys, I guess.
A keen anti-fascist.
Sorry, Joe, we've heard from you, mate.
Very keen.
So, oh yes, Sam, who can't speak for himself right now, born in Ardwick, 1908, joins the Navy at 15, deserted, arrested, returned to the UK. But really, I mean, Mike was saying to me earlier that joining the Navy really was the making of Sam in some respects. And he leaves for Spain quite early on with I think it's his sister's boyfriend, a guy called Michael, correct me, as a Maskey. Is that right?
Bert Maskey.
Bert Maskey, yes. He's killed, isn't he? He's killed at Jarama, but
The first day, we don't know where he's buried.
right. Unlike a lot of the volunteers. Now, Sam becomes very important. He has some experience of a Lewis machine gun, which he got through the Navy, and he trains others to use it. In fact, at the first major battle of the war, he's the battalion armourer. And Sam, Eddie Frau told me, every time Sam was wounded, he came back and did some promotion, whilst he was recuperating, came back and did sort of speaking tours around Manchester and the rest of the country. He becomes, first of all, a company commander, gets a leg wound at Brunetti. He then becomes a captain. He becomes a battalion commander. Because officers had a short life expectancy, actually. He gets the equivalent. The Spanish Medal of Valor is the equivalent of the Victoria Cross. And he's promoted to the rank of major. He died in 1975, and there is a blue plaque, I believe, on the house. Is that right, Mike?
Yeah, he died in 1983 in Sheffield.
Did he? Do you know what? I got this. This tells you a lot. Do you know where I got that 75 from?
Nope.
Wikipedia. What a load of nonsense.
Bollocks, yeah. 1983 in Sheffield.
Well, I'm sorry about that. Okay.
Right, and Nan Green came and Patience Darton. And
okay.
Right. Anyway, my picture's vanished or something's happened, but I'm here if you can hear me.
Can you see the screen?
Yeah, no, I can't see the screen anymore.
Can you hear?
Yeah, I can hear you now, but I don't want to lose anything. Right.
Okay. On. So, Benny.
Went to Spain. I had no passport. The ports of Spain were all blockaded by the warships.
So what time, when was this? Was this
This was in-
1937?
That was early January 37. And when I went along to see Mick Jenkins at Communist Party headquarters, I understood that this was the only route possible to get into Spain.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't aware of how it was possible to get into Spain. And I explained to you that he sent me home for a week.
To think about it?
Yes, to give the matter careful consideration. And then I came back the following week and I said that I was still of the same opinion, that I wanted to go to Spain. And then he organised it. I didn't tell my parents, I didn't tell my friends. I had it to myself all week. And then I went to Spain, and then about 2 weeks later I wrote a letter home.
There's more to that story actually, which is I'll have to move on, but Benny was really amusing actually, and so had great humour.
I went to Spain. I had no
We've
passport.
heard that side. So the journey in.
He came along. We didn't know that we were going to across the Pyrenees.
I mean, you walked from Perpignan, did you?
We walked from Perpignan practically to over the frontier, and then about a mile over the frontier we went in a coach, in a camion to Figueres.
Right. What time of the year? It was January, right?
It was January, yes,
Yeah,
late
I mean-
January.
There must have been plenty of snow around, really.
It was knee deep in snow.
What were
We
you
climbed-
wearing? What were you know?
I didn't even have an overcoat.
How long did this...
I'd gone in a jacket and shirt and an open neck shirt, and we managed to get as far as Perpignan, and then we were in a barn. There was about 10 or 12 of us, and then this guide came along with 4 more. There were 16 of us actually set out from the barn, and he came along. He didn't speak to us. He spoke to 1 or 2 of them in French. I didn't understand what the devil was happening, and then he led us out, and we all followed him. And we thought, are we going to the railway station? Are we going to trucks? What is happening? And then slowly but surely, it became clear what was happening. And we was on the Pyrenees and walking, and there was snow, knee deep in snow. And we weren't dressed for it at all.
And someone, you said that mechanics didn't survive, or you left somebody...
There was 2 American comrades. As a matter of fact, frankly, I was seriously thinking of joining them. I'd almost reached the depth of despair. We're dog tired. This was about 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah.
And we'd been walking then for several hours. And we weren't walking, we were just going up a mountain and down the other side, and another mountain, down the other side, and just going on and on and on and on. And it was endless. I don't know how many miles we covered, but it was endless. And about 3 or 4 o'clock, they said they were absolutely shattered. They couldn't put one leg in front of the other, and we had to leave them there.
Did you ever see them again? Or?
No, we never knew what happened.
So you should be, hopefully you can see a map of Spain divided into 2, and it's the Republican and nationalist territory early on in the struggle, in the war. And the photographs on the right of that are the fort of Figueres, which is actually it's a bit of away from you, but I have a map. Figueres is, as you probably know, if you've been to the Costa South, so it's just over the border. Getting to how people got there was, it was touch and go really. And although Benny, as you said, he went in January 37, and he has to walk across. Initially the French government had an open border, and then they closed it. Now, interestingly, if we can go on to Bernard.
He came along. We didn't know that we were going to go across the Pyrenees.
I mean, you walked from Perpignan, did you?
We walked from Perpignan practically.
Yeah. Bernard, although he went in February, ended up in a coach being driven across the border. Sam, Mike,
Yeah.
do you know anything about Sam's journey?
Well, I said, "Oh, did you walk over the Pyrenees?" Because I was a keen climber as a kid, you know. And he says, "No, we got a coach round, you know."
Yeah.
They were in November '36 before.
Yeah, before
So
they closed the border. I'm
Yeah,
not
they went to Figueres, and then from there they went to Albacete and
Albacete.
Madrigueras, yeah.
Yeah, just north of Albacete, which we'll go to now, because there's various different experiences also, as well as getting in there, about the amount of training. I mean, the practical, when he's talked, Benny said he went to see Mick Jenkins in party offices on Rusholme Road. People were interviewed there. And then they went to London, and there was a second interview. And if they were got a weekend ticket to Paris, because most working people didn't have passports. What the Comintern made of what it made facilitated was masses of people going. The people that like Orwell and others and who went prior to that very early on often had, maybe they spoke some Spanish and they had means as well, and possibly connections, and possibly had some experience of foreign travel. Bernard and Benny, and Sam was in the Navy, so obviously he'd had some training, but certainly Joe Norman, Bernard and Benny were not people who were used to going abroad. So let's hear about some of the training they got at Madrigueras, because that varies as well.
And how much training did you get then?
Very little training. The first time I saw a rifle was in Madrigueras, and we were shown how to put a clip into the rifle. The clip even didn't have bullets, but you showed how to put the clip in. You were shown how to handle the rifle.
Was it Soviet made?
Was
it Soviet made?
It was a Soviet rifle, but after the start of the First World War. I don't think that rifles as rifles.
How much training did you get then?
Very little training. Elementary. We didn't fire it because ammunition was very, very scarce and precious. And the first time I fired a rifle was a Harama, and fired it at someone to kill him.
It's a battle. How long?
Well, I was lucky. I had about 3 months training.
Right.
Grim. Went right through the French infantry handbook, start to finish, under a very demanding commandant. He was a Czech.
Czech?
A Czech, yes.
Right.
Obviously he's had military experience. Little dumpy fella. Always reminded me of Puskas later on. But his stuff and ran the section well.
Right. What kind of rifle was it? Was it were you using Soviet arms?
Yes, we had mixed arms rifles at the moment, but well, at first, Mausers, all French, all Swiss ones, anything. But we used them. They were loaded, they were fired, and we had a firing range went out not just round the back. This was on the outskirts, Albacete and Alden, that had been taken over. And they had constructed a firing range out, and we used it. And we, as I say, we're marching contacts. At the same time, we were rifle drill, machine gun drill, right. Light machine gun, heavy machine gun maxims, hand grenades, small, how do you call them? Mortars, small mortars, spring loaded, shelling, stand back. They were big. They weren't the big ones, but they were useful. Although I never used them myself later on. Never used them. For some reason, we never used them on the front line. Yeah, they were damn useful.
Okay, so who were the international brigaders from Britain? What's your typical idea? You see, because there is a lot of writers went, or some writers went, and there was, you know, W.H. Auden talks about poets going off like bombs, etc. But look, the vast majority of International Brigade volunteers were working class men. The biggest regional group was South Wales miners, actually. Richard Baxell, who's, you know, still writing, has written a wonderful book called Unlikely Warriors. And I know people who read about the IB always take issue with one thing or another, but, you know, he has done a kind of fairly detailed breakdown. It's 75% they weren't all, actually. There's a myth, there are so many myths about the International Brigade, that they were desperate and they were unemployed and etc. It was 75% had left jobs to go, manual working class jobs. So Benny was an upholsterer in North Manchester, in Cheetham. Bernard's clerk in a textile mill. Joe, I think, was unemployed at the time he went. He'd done an apprenticeship at Metrovix, but when you get to 21, they didn't want to pay the adult wage. And he became active in the unemployed workers movement. The average age was 29. And now 50%, Richard Baxell says, had some prior military training, but, you know, that might not, it's not exactly having been through, in some cases, an infantry handbook, etc. Around half, slightly over half, were members of the Communist Party, or in some cases, the Young Communist League. And although the party were careful initially about, at least about who they sent, because they got a lot of negative media and accusations were made that they were recruiting people from the embankment, or, you know, etc., conning people, etc. There was a very high casualty rate. It's Battle of Britain levels of casualties. 1 in 5 are killed. Nearly all are wounded once. I mean, Sam Wilde takes 6 bullets. Is that right, Mike?
In his first engagement at Harama, he must have been machine gun, because he got, I think, 4 bullets through him. But he was wounded, I think, 5 times, separate times.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it was dangerous, and even Orwell was wounded twice, and he barely came across the enemy. I mean, you know, it was very, you know, and the Daily Express and other papers said that people were going, you know, for money. The pay was negligible. You got 8 pesetas a day, and maybe 1 or 2 pesetas a day whilst you're on leave, and there wasn't much leave. The story that Benny tells, and I haven't put in the excerpt, was that when he also wrote to his trades union branch to say, I'm in Spain. He was in a furniture maker's, he was an upholsterer's, and there were 2 major furniture manufacturing trade unions. He writes and says, oh, I'm in Spain, comrades, etc. And they send him, have a collection and send him a £5 postal order. He says this, like, the idea that he's going to go, there was nothing, you know, there were no shops or anything to go and spend it on. A number of women served from Britain in medical staff, and one in particular I want to talk about, incredible woman, Madge Addy. Okay, so there's a battalion, and there's brigades, and there's companies, and actually at the top of it all there's divisions. And the British battalion was inside, I think it was the 16th battalion inside the 15th brigade. A brigade is around 4,500 men, and a battalion is up to 700. A company is about 150, 175. And because they lost so many men, I mean, a lot of the foreign international brigade battalions would have Spaniards in their midst. And there were times when the British battalion, it didn't even have enough people left alive to be called a battalion. It was, I suppose, more of an English-speaking battalion initially. There were volunteers from Britain and Ireland, Also Cyprus, South Africa and Australia, about 80 volunteers from Australia. In January of 1937, a number of the Irish left the British battalion when they came clean. So a couple of the British officers came clean and said that they had served, I think with the Black and Tans actually, that we referred to as the auxiliaries in the Irish War of Independence. And not all, but a number of those then joined the American, the Abraham Lincolns. So the first major battle is Jarama, which is in February, as Mike says, which begins in February 37. And what happens is basically, if we're going back to that map, Madrid is quite close to the nationalist forces. The Republican government have moved to Valencia, which doesn't fill people with confidence, I guess. It's a controversial decision. And Franco attempts to cut off the main road around Madrid. I think it's to the west, the southeast of Madrid, to Valencia. And anyway, Benny picks up the story. Come on, Benny.
We fought there. The American government realised the objective of Franco. They threw in the Lister division, which is a crack division of the Republican Army, and the Campesinos, which is another crack division, and the 11th, the Dimitrovs, the 12th, the Garibaldis, the 13th, the Tailmen, the 14th, the American Lincolns, and the 15th, which was the British, and the whole of the International Brigade was thrown in Jarama. We fought there. The battalion, the battle commenced on the 12th of February. At that time I was still in Madrigueras training, and we suffered very heavy casualties indeed, and everybody in Madrigueras was put on trucks and sent immediately to Jarama. That was going to be the crux.
How did you feel when you thought you were going on to this battle? Do you remember?
How did we feel?
Were you ready to go? Or?
Yes, ready to go. In those days, we were fired with a lot of enthusiasm for the fight against fascism. I was very politically minded,
right.
Very politically minded. As indeed the climate at that time, it was a charged climate, moving towards World War. And everybody participated. It's not like it is today. Today the youth no longer are politically conscious. The class war itself has not raised itself to a very sharp point.
No.
Right, the battle commenced. We got there at Jarama, and I was there for 4 or 5 days, and an explosion I was behind an olive tree. That was my own olive tree, and I dug a little hole behind it, a little box hole behind it, and then an explosion took place. I don't know whether it was a mortar or whether it was a grenade, but blood started pouring off the bottom of my chin. And I knew then that I had been wounded in the head. And if you get wounded in the head, the odds are that you're going to die. And I didn't want to die. So I galloped back. Bullets were whistling past right, left and centre. But I got to the FAP. When I got to the FAP, they slapped a big wound dressing on my head. They asked me if I wanted a stretcher bearer to take me to the clearing station. I said no. And one comrade came along with me to show me where the clearing station was. And we went along to the road. When I got to the clearing station, there was, I'm not sure if it was German or Polish or Czechoslovakian, They spoke in a very, very peculiar language, and he put me on a stretcher, waiting for the ambulance to come. There was about 4 or 5 of us. There was a couple of chaps wounded in the arms and legs. The ambulance came. We were still under fire, and the ambulance stopped for a minute. They woofed a couple of the chaps with arms and neck wounds into the ambulance, and the ambulance shot off again. And I was rather peeved that I hadn't been put in the ambulance.
Casualties at Harama were high, and I think it was a shock to everyone, and people back in Britain who'd sent them. On a single day, the British battalion took 275 casualties out of 600. 11 from the city of Manchester died on that day. In fact, I was at the Working Class Movement Library the other day, and I had this, I've got this, a photocopy of it's the Communist Party district report to a Congress, and it's a list of the people that died, typed up, and then written in ink is a much longer list. So between typing up the document and it being circulated, news had come through of another 7 or 8 people that had been killed. Sam, as Mike said, was one of those wounded on February the 12th, and he was in hospital to 7th of May, and then returned to the front. And they were in the trenches, really, all the way, I think, till June. In the end, actually, the International Brigade, the input from the International Brigade did help halt Franco's advance around Madrid. They were successful. It's slowing the advance, really. But there were desertions. It's, you know, I'm not surprised, really. Fred Copeman, who was wounded in the head, was a battalion commander at that time, said, groups of men led by some of the finest members of the battalion were leaving the line without permission. People who were caught were not shot for desertion. It was talked about, though. Punishment usually involved digging latrines for the guardhouse. I suppose apart from any moral considerations, it was a volunteer force, and it's not reasonable when you actually also need people to join. So Bert Maskey, he was killed at Harama, wasn't he, Mike? Is that right? He went out. And there's a chap called, I think, was Clem Beckett killed at Harama? Yeah, he was. Yeah, I want to talk about Clem. He's a really interesting character as well. Okay, moving on. I'm aware of the time here, guys.
The Republican government realised the
how much training did you get?
Very little.
Sorry about this.
Very little. Franco, they threw in the Lister division, which is a crack division of the Republican Army, and the Campesinos, which is another crack division. I was very polemic.
Here we are. Okay. So this is Bernard McKenna, who goes out. He makes his way to Spain at the time of Harama, and he first sees action at the Battle of Brunetti, which was in July. Again, it's another attempt by Franco to capture the capital.
I went out in February 37.
Right.
And I went into action in 5th of July.
Right.
Battle of Brunetti.
That was what Walter Gregory said, it's a ferocious battle.
It was. 300 went in, 8 came out.
That's right.
The rest were wounded, missing, killed. But we were based up in the Guadaramas. We came down on the plain and moved over to undulating, mainly flat, but a couple of hills there.
Yeah.
Being wheat, scorching hot day, probably the hottest day of the year. 1 or 2 little ravines in it where we sheltered for a while, and then so we had the outpost. The man in charge was a Bulgarian, he was an officer. 23, 24 days, maybe a bit longer. I was wounded the first day, went back to hospital.
You were shot in the foot, didn't you?
Yeah, it's only a slight wound, but it bled, and so anyway. as it got better, I was hanging around, but I could walk a bit. But as soon as I could walk a bit better, I got out and stayed in a hotel in Madrid, and then contacted my contacts and said, oh, what am I supposed to be doing here? He said, nothing.
I mean, the battles in the Spanish Civil War is so in our history really European, hidden behind us the Second World War, obviously. As some historians argue that really was the beginning of the Second World War. Anthony Beaver doesn't think so, and neither do I. But they were big battles, and so the Republicans alone lost 20,000 men in Brunetti. The losses at Jarama were sort of 20 to 30,000 on both sides. These are huge. These are not, I mean, people might have seen Ken Loach's film Land of Freedom and skirmishes in villages, etc., which did take place. But really, the war was decided in these large-scale engagements and by aerial bombardment. This is Joe Norman talking about his rations.
Rations?
Yes.
Oh, gee whiz. Black beans and burro. Most of the time. 99% of the time, that's all we got. If we got it. Depends what action you're in and how far you were in front, away from the supply lines, If there was no roads to get the food up, then we'd have to go out with a patrol. Me and 6 men. Walk about 6 miles back, carry the rum ration, food in containers on your back, That's when you could get it up. Sometimes you were days without food. I've been 10 days without a bite. When I've been fighting Brigade actions,
Was this common to be without food, or was it
unusual? No, it wasn't common. In the main, when we weren't in action, we got fed all right. But it was mostly bureau, minced bureau and black beans,
I went out in February 37,
Right.
and I went into action in 5th of July.
Rations.
I know.
Oh, gee whiz.
I know. Where are we? Slide 8. Okay, so there's some quotes from Sam from his interviews that are at the Working Class Movement Library. I mean, Sam, the Red Army or Red Army advisors who were present not in great numbers actually at all in Spain. They used to say about Sam Wilde, the English lion. He was known for his courage. He said, you had to take the fighting in your stride. We were put in a position on a hill confronted by Germans and Moors and suffered casualties. 2 through my arm, 2 through my body. A lad led me out when he got a bullet in his leg. All 4 went through me. Sam was a political, I mean, Mike's going to tell us a bit more. He was a political commissar as well, I think. But as an officer, he was absolutely clear. You had to be the first to attack, the last to retreat. Officers were elected by the men in the early days because of political cohesion. There was spirit in the army like no other. Now, this is interesting because when he first arrives in December 36, that's what they're doing. They're electing officers. And because he had some military experience, he's elected an officer, and he's very much against this because he has some experience of soldiering. He knows it's a ridiculous thing to do. And actually, Joe Norman says in the early days as well that it is a different kind of army, and I'll say something about that at the end. It's a different kind of military organisation, the International Brigade. But in the early days, you didn't even salute. They didn't salute the officers. Joe said he just walked up to them and said, all right. In 1937, the Republican Army absorbed the International Brigade into the Republican Army. Initially it's kind of autonomous to an extent, and it also absorbs the militias, the POUM militia and the anarchist militia, the CNT, and which is another story and a conversation with a pub. This is Sam talking about when he came back. I'd become so attached to Spain and the Spanish people. I became sad. I felt guilty. I find this hard to read, actually. I find it's a very emotional subject. Leaving the Spanish people at that time, coming back to a country that had behaved infamously. They were the happiest days I've spent, the most fruitful days I've spent. After I never did anything that was worthwhile. In Spain, I made a contribution for the correct cause. And this is his daughter, Dolores, who he named after La Passionara, Dolores. Mike, what's Dolores' Passionara's surname?
Dolores Ibaruri.
Right. When Sam came back from Spain, he was just another unemployed working class man, and the experience he'd had in Spain meant nothing, really. In Spain, though, the situation used the kind of natural skills and abilities my father had. And I don't think he ever really found a role for himself afterwards. And Michael talk, I mean, I don't think that is necessarily, I don't know. He did a lot of things in Britain when he came back, actually. He was an important trade unionist. Anyway, let's move on. So these are just some of the Manchester veterans. Clem Beckett, I don't know if you can see my cursor on, can we see it, Mary, on Clem's face?
Sorry, I was just looking at the chat, some interesting details coming out about some background reading and films.
Oh, great. Can you see my cursor on this man's face?
Yes, I can.
Right, that's Clem Beckett. And Clem, he was actually a friend of the writer Christopher Caldwell, and they were both killed together in a machine gun. He was a speedway rider of some repute, of international repute, and he rode the Wall of Death in Bellevue, and he formed a trade union for speedway riders called the Dirt Track Riders Association. Yeah, and he died at Jarama, and there's a quote from the letter he wrote just before the battle. It's the last sort of recorded thing he wrote to his wife. It says, "I'm sure you realise that I should never have been satisfied had I not assisted. Only my hatred of fascism brought me here." And there were, I think, so this is George Fletcher from Moss Side. He survived. Joseph Buckley, he was a driver, survived. This is Maurice Levine, who also survived, I think. Yeah, Maurice seriously did. He wrote a really interesting book from Cheetham to Cordova. He was a sort of Russian Jew, really, in Manchester, and a very articulate and a good writer. But you know, by and large, these guys just, I don't know, they're manual workers. This chap here served in the First World War, and died in Spain as well. And then the woman, this photograph here, the woman laying down is the nurse Madge Addy, whose incredible story, really. She formed a Manchester ward. There was a castle, which was really the Republican IB hospital, and she raised money and used to come back to England, raise money and do rallies. And she was a hairdresser. And to be honest, actually, I think the hairdresser in Chorlton, where she was, is still a hairdresser to this day. And she trained as a nurse, went out to Spain. And when the International Brigade was withdrawn, she refused to go. And she stayed with the wounded. And she was put in a camp. The British Embassy got her out. And then during the Second World War, she was recruited by SOE, Special Services, Special Operations, and fought with the French resistance. This is Joe. on the impact of war.
To a place like that, there were such enormous numbers of fatalities. How did you react?
Well, some it shattered, of course, but most of us became callous, you know, saw comrades wounded and killed, you know. And, if you see enough of it, it doesn't affect you the same. That's what's so terrible about war, you know. If you see enough suffering, it doesn't affect you anymore.
That's presumably what makes people capable of killing other people in a war.
That's right.
I mean, it was a war of atrocities. Actually, the wider war. I think I've got the figures somewhere. A good 500,000 people were killed, but 200,000 people were killed in atrocities, and atrocities were committed by both sides. There was really terrible anti-clerical violence, mainly by anarchists in the first year of the war, although the nationalists killed priests who were loyal to the Republic. Women, rape was used by the nationalist side just as part of the course. It was the first war in Western society where women were armed and bore arms and fought alongside men on the Republican side. And Joe talks about hearing about women that fought but never met any. And the first British person to be killed in combat is this woman here in the tops, called Felicia Brown, who was incredibly tough. She was a sculptor, and she was in Berlin in the 20s and early 30s, and she fought in the late 20s. She was fighting brown shirts on the streets. She went to Spain. There was Hitler held an Olympics in 1936. You'll probably know the Berlin Olympics. Now there was a counter kind of Olympiad that was due to be held in Spain in that summer. I'm actually not sure whether I'm hesitating because I'm not sure whether it was Madrid or Barcelona. And she was on her way there with her friend, a photographer, and civil war breaks out, and she fights. 3 weeks later, she's dead. This woman to her left is very iconic photographs. Marina, I've got it somewhere. Marina Ginesta. It was 4 days into Franco's rise in Barcelona. She survived. She fled the country at the end, and she lived in the Dominican Republic, I think. And it wasn't until really at the end of her life, very many years ago, that she was aware of the existence of the photograph, actually. This Mujeres Libres was an anarchist organisation, women's organisation of around 30,000. And the poster, I think, translated says, "Your family is made up of all the freedom fighters." Someone's Spanish might be better than mine. But the anarchist militia had women fighters, and they formed their own group because they thought the anarchist men were so sexist. And in fact, Orwell writes this thing where he sees these women drilling in Barcelona, and the anarchist men are laughing at him, etc. But they fought independently. Anyway, so I mean that's a story. Again, it's a Zoom meeting, or there's a book about this called Milicianos by Lisa Lines, Women in Combat in the Spanish Civil War. Where are we up to? Well, I'm looking at the time. It's been nearly an hour, and I really, I just want to do 1 or 2 more slides, really, and then I'm going to ask some people to come in. I think what I want to do is go sort of a bit to what's happened there. That's weird. to slide. San Pedro. San Pedro is a concentration camp, really, and it's where a lot of the International Brigade ended up. It's where Joe ended up, and Bernard. Sam had been wounded, was out of the country, I think, came back just as they were being repatriated. And Benny, I don't think Benny was captured. I just wanted to experience the Joe, terrible experience. Joe was on the camp committee.
But twice after that, at 3 o'clock in the morning in the dark, into the yard, and faced us with firing squads, all the committee. We thought it was off, you know, because they weren't squeamish about seeing you off, you know. I thought, bloody hell, what a way to die from a firing squad, you know. It was really rough. And they saw many of our lads off without trial, and, you know, even without warning.
How were you treated?
Badly.
In what respect?
All respects. Thin blanket, bag of straw, ridden with lice, poor food, beatings, no medical attention.
What did they beat you for? Just arbitrarily?
Just being there. Used to bash us. You went out from 3 floors up, had to go down stone stairs to the courtyard where they served up the food, such as it was, very poor. Thin, gruely soup, piece of ricey bread each day. Didn't get meat at all. Some sardines, big sardines. We had a big sardine tin. It was our holder held the soup. Our heads were shaven, which is a blessing because of cutting lice. They go up and down. Clothes were in rags. We slept, and we were lucky compared to the Americans. We had a wooden floor to sleep on. They slept on a stone floor.
So, yeah, there's a book about San Pedro, and it's by an American. There's a lot of American ended their time there, and he describes it as like a preview of Dakar or Buchenwald. And Joe talks. I mean, Joe talks about people. They're just being, you know, people with someone just arbitrarily murdered, really. And the International Brigade, what's left of them, returned to the UK and elsewhere in the end of '38. Although some people can't return, German and Italians can't return. Canadians can't return because for some reason their government refused their repatriation. Bernard and Benny were invoiced, really. The British government sent them an invoice for £5 for the cost of their repatriation, which they both showed me and didn't pay. So they're dying day. So look, I'd spoken for an hour now, and I really should shut up. And I would, Mike, could you just say, can you hear me, Mike?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Mike. So this, I just wanted Mike to say a few words. Mike is Sam Wild's son.
Well, yeah, I'm sorry. I'm on my mobile phone, and if my battery conks out, I've got it plugged in, but it is conking, so apologies. I don't know whether you can see me on the
I can see you and hear you.
Right.
They usually used to say that when you paint them, you should wash them in water with washing up liquid, because there's oils and stuff. You see how they go, but they might not stay. But you can paint them with wood glue, watered down wood glue.
Okay, Mike.
Do you want me to say something?
I do.
Oh, sorry. I thought I heard somebody else talking.
Yeah, it's okay. I just muted it. Yeah.
No. Well, me and Michael had never communicated till today. I think we phoned each other and discovered that we'd got these things in common. I've been always interested, obviously, in Spain because I knew a lot of the old brigaders. I was born in 1939, the year they came. You know, my dad got married to Bessie, and I knew a lot of these people as still young men. And through the Cold War, when nobody was interested in supporting the ideas, and they were, you know, regarded as anything from premature fascists to stooges and dupes. And there's my mum and dad and George Fletcher and Francis, his wife. They were married on April the 1st, 1939, when Franco won the war on that same day. I don't think they planned that. I think that was in Manchester, Albert Hall. My dad, when he came back, he led them back to Victoria in London, and there was a massive welcome, and they were really greeted by politicians and left-wingers and ordinary people. They marched later to the cenotaph to lay a wreath, and the policeman tried to stop them, but my dad said, "You're not going to do that, are you?" And they said, "No, Sam," and let them through, because there was a lot of sympathy even amongst the policemen. He regarded it as like the high point of his life, and afterwards, although he was very active in the trade unions and in politics and the Communist Party, he never had the same sense of comradeship and high spots in terms of action as he ever had in Spain. And so he didn't be a disappointed man, because you know, he'd got a family and a fulfilled life in that sense. But I don't think the post-Spain period was a successful period, and also they wouldn't let him into the British Army because he'd been a deserter from the British Navy when he, you know, didn't want to be part of the imperial war machine, as he said. And he'd been a major in Spain, and I don't think they wanted an active communist and a military man in the British Army, although a lot of brigaders did join the British forces, and quite successfully as well. So,
well, yeah, I mean, that is a story, really, because when Sam left to go, he wasn't a communist. He joined the Spanish Communist Party while he was over there.
No, he wasn't. He was a left winger and a natural rebel, and his Irish background made him a Fenian and a natural rebel. I mean, he was enrolled with Bert by George Brown, the Manchester, and they had common. He was devastated when George got killed at the Brunetti battle.
But there was this ridiculous line because of the Nazi-Soviet pact in 1939. The Communist Party had this particular line, didn't they, for the first year or so of the war, that until Russia was invaded, that they were sort of half-hearted about the war. But Benny Goulburn joins a tank regiment, Bernard McKenna joins the RAF.
Yeah.
Sam tries to join up, but they won't have him because he's so well known, and he would have been a brilliant soldier. Madge Addy ends up working for the resistance, and Joe Norman is in the RAF as well. And Bernard said, "Sod the Communist Party and their stupid line." And and these people fought the black shirts, then went to fight Franco.
Yeah.
And then fought Hitler. It was a long 10 years for them. There's some really interesting questions. There's one thing I wanted to address. It's about, in the photograph, there's a black soldier, and there's a question about that and how common this was. Well, there is something quite particular that happened. He's an American, actually. They're Americans, I think, in that photograph. The American forces were segregated until 1948, okay? They're not in the terms of the International Brigade, and there's a number of black veterans who fought. And in particular, Captain Oliver Law, who was commanding officer of the American battalion, and it's the first example of a black officer leading white troops in a battle in America, and Oliver Law's killed. It's Brunetti, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, he was killed at Brunetti. Oh hell, yeah.
He was killed where?
On the Mosquito Ridge. Yeah.
Yeah. Was that Brunetti?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Thank God I got something right. Yeah. So, would anybody else like to speak? Do people know how to raise their hand?
John Allen would like to speak.
John, you can unmute yourself.
What?
I can hear you, John.
Hello.
Hello, John.
Did somebody ask me to speak?
Yeah. Did you have
Yes,
something to say?
Have you got a question?
No, I'm enjoying this really. I was in Spain in 1976 to 1978 in the Basque Country, and I'm 67 now. But in terms of a question, when I also went back to Madrid, I was told that the nationalist government was an illegal government. I was told that when I was teaching in Madrid in 88. I was just teaching students, you know. I didn't know much about the history of the Civil War. But what about the legality of the nationalist government?
Well, it didn't really. But I mean, power talks, really. I mean, I said right at the beginning, I don't think either side really paid much attention to election results. And what happened in Spain really should be a lesson for us today. Institution after institution peels away from a support for democracy. The church, the army, political parties, trade unions, etc., one after the other. And at the end, just before the war, I mean, there's a terrific number of arms, small arms in Spain. The deputies to the Spanish Parliament, the Cortes, most of them are carrying revolvers into the Parliament, and they have to hand them in at reception, like you do. Franco won, and there was military martial law continued to 1948. 30,000 Spaniards were sent to Germany, to Nazi Germany. Half of them were used for slave labour, and the other half were sent to German concentration camps. 500,000 Spaniards were put in concentration camps in Spain. And I wrote an article recently, last week or so, for Spiked about I'm really just quoting from these interviews, really, just really trying to get behind the mythology. And I got a huge amount of flack for I never knew there were so many supporters of General Franco in Britain. And it's a very still a contentious subject, particularly in Spain. And I've never seen a book written about an international brigade by a Spaniard. We've got 2 participants that raised their hand, Mary.
Yes, the next, Jeff Brown would like to ask.
Oh, Jeff, brilliant.
Yeah, I mean, just following on from what you're saying, I want to recommend to people to catch the film The Silence of Others, which some of you will have seen, which is actually picking up on what's been happening in Spain in the last few years as people have tried to dig out the truth and indeed the bodies of their relatives and how they died. And it's a fantastically powerful film. And what it does, I think, is it really gives a very powerful insight into how civil war, the sheer brutality of the Spanish Civil War, and I can well understand Sam Wilde's, commitment to what he was doing there, because clearly here were people who were in the most appalling circumstances. I mean, it needs always to be mentioned that, Franco had support from Hitler and Mussolini. They were much better equipped, and as such, they were, in a much stronger position militarily. And that, I've got a question here, really, which is, my understanding is that the whole, the commitment of the International Brigade, that it could be used as a unit when basically the situation was so desperate that only people of the highest, commitment could be expected to actually withstand the casualties that were going to inevitably ensue in some form in the combat. And Jarama and Brunetti are two examples that have already been mentioned.
That's a really, really good question, because the IB were used as shock troops, really. And shock troops, armies have shock troops, but shock troops are elites, the best trained. The Moors were the shock troops for Franco, very experienced. And they're facing, the IB are facing, they face them at Jarama. But it's not just Jarama, it's not just Brunetti, it's all the way through, right to the Ebro. And this is partly explains why the casualty rate is so high. And there are various theories about this. They say in an army that a soldier's worst enemy is not the enemy, it's the commanding officer who sends them into particular situations. And Joe Norman, which I haven't played the excerpt, is adamant, and there is a book that he quotes, that he says as evidence, is that Franco had people inside the Republican army at the top. That this was a ploy right from the beginning, that he left officers on that side for the basis of spying and also losing the war. I don't see any evidence for this, and I've spoken to people who say, there is no evidence for this. The fact is that the Republican Army used the IB as shock troops, and you're absolutely right, because their courage was renowned. They kind of broke the rules, really, and so at Jarama, I think Anthony Beaver, or I think they're naive, and they actually stand on the skyline and make themselves targets. You cannot, they were ill-trained, relatively speaking. A lot of them were malnourished, actually, the Brits, even if they were working. They were not physically as fit as a soldier should be. Also, the average age is 29 in the UK, but other battalions, so the Germans and the Italians in the IB, there are many of them who are in their 40s, because actually they're not coming from Germany and Italy. They're emigres that are coming from Paris and Prague and elsewhere that had been escaping oppression. There was something else you said. Yes, they were used as shock troops, and which explains the high casualty rate, because they could be relied on, really, to stand their ground. I think and the British battalion did have a reputation. There were, so like Benny says, there were some other battalions though that were more professionally trained, the Dimitrovs, and Bernard says that the military, most of the French had been through a kind of national service. That amongst the international brigades, the British soldiers were probably the least likely to have had much military experience. Have I answered that, Jeff? Have you got anything else?
Yeah, no. I just want to pick up one thing quickly, which is this, you mentioned the Moors, and without going into too much detail, one of the standard points that's made about the Republic is that it failed to give the Spanish colonies of Africa. And the Moors were these troops which were, very important, as you say. And if they had been given the option by the Republic to have their own independence, that would have taken away from Franco.
Massively, yeah. They should have given independence to Morocco, because I think it was talked about prior to the Popular Front being elected.
The only question is, are there ever inside the International Brigade, or the reminiscences thereof, any discussion of some of the political mistakes that the Republic makes?
I don't know, but Mike, I was speaking to Mike earlier. Oh, first of all, I should have mentioned this. I've just written it down. There were 19,000 German troops and 80,000 Italian troops fighting for the nationalists. And I mean, we know about the bombing of Guernica, but the Luftwaffe were present throughout the war. Madrid was bombed. The troop positions, I mean, or even Orwell was bombed, and they didn't have much to do. And the troop positions, the trenches, were strafed by aircraft. For it was, you know, they couldn't, and the Republican government is not allowed to buy arms. You know, I mean, Ribbentrop, the German Foreign Secretary, said the non-intervention committee would be better to be described and call itself the intervention committee, because everybody who signed the non-intervention agreement intervened. And, you know, and that's in, if I can quote from von Ribbentrop's memoirs, which is an unusual thing to do. They didn't really stand a chance up against that kind of firepower, and the fact that they could not buy arms on the market. The only country that really, as a government, supported the Republic wholeheartedly was Mexico. Someone else, there's another question. Is there another hand, Mary?
No, we've had John Allen and Jeff Brown now, and those were the two.
The decisions that the Republican, well, Jeff's question, I don't know. Mike Wild, are you still there?
No, his phone's died.
His phone's died. Well, Mike was telling me earlier that Sam would regularly, he would, as a battalion leader, he was crucially aware. I mean, this is not a guy who's frightened, but he would disobey or confront superior officers about putting men in suicidal positions. He wouldn't have it. Yeah. And they were asked to really put their heads above the parapet more often than they even did. Which, I don't know, my general view, and people might come back at me on this, about the International Brigade, is that it's long overdue that this subject and these people are dragged out into the light of the mainstream. For too long, I mean, what, the Soviet Union's gone, the Berlin Wall's down, what the hell, what are the establishment frightened of? You know, why is it Simon Sharma? I know this raises eyebrows, but I think Simon Sharma does everybody a bit of justice in one way or another, whether you be George Orwell, Winston Churchill, Winston Smith, Thomas à Becket, or Henry II. He kind of empathises, and he needs to get hold of this subject by the scruff of the neck and educate a television audience. It shouldn't be left to Ken Loach or whatever. And, you know, I'm a member of the International Brigade Memorial Trust, and it's great, but I've been surprised at how, you know, very historically literate people in Britain, friends, colleagues, whatever, know so little about this subject, and it's hugely important. And it's a huge importance of for me, it's about internationalism, not supranationalism. It's about people of one country supporting a fight for democracy amongst working people elsewhere. Would anybody like to raise a hand, or have I just exhausted people?
You might like to go on the chat.
3 participants raised a hand. Jeff Brown's, Marcia Waldstreicher.
Yes.
Marcia.
Hi from America. How are you?
Wow, hi.
So I was the one who posted the information about one of the documentaries about the Abraham Lincoln Brigade.
Yeah.
The screenwriter died in May at the age of 89, not COVID related, but they actually had a screening of the film And they, if you go on YouTube, if you type in forever activists, you can actually find a video of the Q&A, and they have some of the children and other children of the American members of the International Brigade, most of whom were Jewish, for at least for this documentary, and what that meant to them. So I thought that might be interesting.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I do get the newsletter from Alba, and very interesting it is. And I mean, I don't know, how much is the International Brigade remembered in America, Marcia?
Not much at all. I mean, especially because, well, first off, a lot of them, because they were branded as being communist, even if they weren't necessarily allowed to join up again during the Second World War. Though there are some interesting connections between those who couldn't serve during the Second World War who went over to try to help Israel, because they'd already they weren't allowed in the American military, so they sometimes went over to try to help with that effort in '48 after the war ended. But it's not really talked about, and that's why she made this documentary. I know that I know that my grandmother was against the war, but I also know that she was quite anti-Franco. I have a letter she wrote to my grandfather from June the 22nd, 1937, that says, "A few days ago I went up to hear Norman Thomas speak. I don't know who Norman Thomas is, but it says, you probably know that he has just returned from Russia and Spain. He told of the ruthless actions of the fascists in Spain and of the very fine spirit of the loyalists. Sometimes I wonder why people don't live with each other instead of against each other. What has one done against the other? Why does one man see fit to encroach upon another's territory and destroy thousands of people and break up homes? In Spain, a home is being made for the children suffering from the feelingless fascist, and my contribution, though small, is going to help. The best part of giving for this cause is that you know what you are giving for, and you know it's going to help, and it makes you feel good. And it may be good, perhaps, to stop all this nonsense." So even in America, they were aware, but unless you were very politically active, it wasn't really in even the news that much compared to what was going on in Germany, in Poland, in other parts of Europe, because the Americans weren't involved. And it basically just kind of got forgotten. You never learn about it in school.
Yeah.
I'm an historian, and I never learned about that in school. It's really hard to find even books about it.
I'm pleased to say I have a nephew in Swansea. But I'm pleased to say that he was taught about South Wales and the International Brigade at school. I mean, a lot of the preponderance or the relative high number of Jews that fought. I mean, people changed their name who went to fight for the International Brigade. A number of people who changed their name were Jewish, away from Jewish names, because they knew. I mean, it turns out if you were captured, very often you were shot anyway, whether you were Jewish or not. But you weren't probably getting out of Spain if you were captured and you were known to be Jewish. I mean, the Gestapo were present at San Pedro.
But you also hear of a lot of people that didn't change their name.
Yeah,
because they were trying to make a point.
Oh, Benny Goldman, yeah. I mean, in North Manchester, there was, I mean, so many. Benny Rothman, who he made ambulances. He tried to go to Spain, wasn't allowed to go. Tried to join the army in the Second World War, wasn't allowed to go. It was because he was a reserved occupation. But yeah, I mean, Henry Suss again, there's another Jewish comrade. it's a really sad, and the Labour Party ended up in this ridiculous anti-Semitism row. I mean, my experience in my 20s of being involved in the left and in trade unions in Britain is that all the so many of the activists were Jewish, you know, and.
Well, that's often the case. Back in the early 20th century, there was the German-American Bund in Poland, and it was a huge proponent of the Russian Revolution. But that's part of where a lot of the anti-Semitism most likely came from, for certain individuals, is that they were quote unquote aligned with the communist movement, or they believed in that, and that's still very often the case, because some of the tenets in Judaism are education. Everybody's supposed to get an education, and giving to others. Charity is one of the major tenets. In fact, there's a holiday every year where you're supposed to give money. You're supposed to leave money for a poor person and then walk away, because they're never supposed to know who gave it to them, because they don't want anybody to feel like they're indebted to somebody else. They're doing it because it's the right thing to do.
Yeah, it's not virtue signaling as we call it today.
Yes.
Well, I mean,
this is exactly what was happening. That's why they were going over. It's the right thing to do. And they didn't really care that. Well, first off, they didn't actually know it would be an issue necessarily when they came back. But even if they did know, I've heard mentioned that a lot of them didn't actually care. They did it because it's the right thing to do. And
well, I wanted, this leads into the question about the problem that the International Brigade, or remembering the International Brigade today, it was mythologized. First thing is, it was mythologized from day one. Franco claimed that there were over 100,000, 120,000 of these Reds from abroad here. The Communist Party of Great Britain exaggerated the numbers. It suited people because they wanted, you know, to do this. And it gets generalized, or I would say misrepresented. What were they fighting for? Everything I read tells me that people, whether they were in, I don't think the Republic itself was fighting for a Soviet Spain, actually. Never mind the IB. They really just wanted a Popular Front government back. There was, you know, and there were very concrete things around that. From 1930, you know, women were given the vote in Spain with the Republic. Franco's going to take that away. Women were given all, you know, a place in the workplace. Franco was going to take all of that away, just to name one thing. And one of the things I come up against is that these were stooges of the Soviet Union. If they had have won, there would have been Soviet gulags everywhere, etc., etc. At the training camp in Madagascar, north of Albacete, I was just reading this week, you know, what the routine was. And there was this kind of like up at 5:45, drill till sort of lunchtime, siesta, and then there were these lectures. There would be lectures on, you know, how many tractors have been made in the Soviet Union this week, kind of stuff. But people complained about that and said, well, can't we just do some small arms fire? Well, no, we haven't got any ammunition to practice with, kind of thing, was the problem. And one wonders whether the lectures were a substitute for arms training because they just didn't have the ammunition. I don't, honestly, they weren't, there was some kind of revolution in Spain, certainly in Catalonia. But what the Republic wanted in the midst of that war, and what many people in the IB wanted, was not that. Actually, what they wanted was their democracy back. And so I read in the Memorial Trust magazine recently, there was an unveiling of a memorial in Oxfordshire, and there's been huge opposition to it, you know, a bunch of Reds memorial type of thing. So I think there's a lot of misrepresentation of what the IB was about. I mean, half of them were, yeah, members of the CP, but what else was there, really? I mean, and let's be clear about this. Clement Attlee,
there were anarchists as well.
not from Britain. Not from
Not from
America.
Britain.
Yeah, there were in Spain, but
Yes.
you know, and for sure. But they were the small minority, really, in terms of the conflict, and were not serious contenders in government. They were not allowed anywhere near the Popular Front government. Jeff, can you want to come back?
Well, if you ask me, yeah, very quickly. You see, I think that the whole context of the 30s, you know, as Victor Serge called it, the midnight in the century, as fascism, you know, is the threat that is, you know, pushing the world towards another war. It's in that context that I think people were fighting, to going and volunteering in these appalling conditions to basically to stop the fascists wherever they were. But the front line was Spain. I think that connects with what Sam Wilde was saying, you know, that you could do things in Britain, but actually if you really wanted to be at the front line against what was a global threat, if you like, was go to Spain.
Yeah, I mean, because there's a context that Benny Goldman mentions at the beginning. Isn't that? I mean, Italy got into Abyssinia.
Right.
Macmillan is prime minister. There's a national government. They're full on appeasement, you know. And Macmillan, I think, went to Harrow and then Eton and then Cambridge or somewhere. Sam Wilde left school something like 11, but he knew fascism better than Macmillan, and they knew that no appeasement was possible.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I'm very. Does anybody else like to say something or ask something? Or just raise your hand if you know how to. Mary, just want to tell people.
Yes, sorry. Somebody called Lee W. Did put on chat. I don't know if you can see this, Mike.
Yeah.
Just wondered why you preferred to say World War II didn't start with the Spanish Civil War. Should we push it to say that it did, if only to flag up the fact that some very brave people joined the fight against Hitler and Mussolini early?
Well, he's right, and I think they did see. I think they wanted to. War was coming for Britain and France. It's not the start of World War II because all the other governments, what we call the Allies, turned their backs. Yeah. It's only with the invasion of Poland that France and Britain declare war, and this is after Czechoslovakia has been occupied. Of course, Germany's short of raw materials leading up to the war and during the war, and it imports its raw materials in through Spanish ports. And it is worth reading the kind of support that Franco gave Hitler. I mean, I think people can only guess. Anthony Beevor says that the Stalin's attitude towards Spain was to bog them down. You know, I mean, Hitler had written in Mein Kampf that he intended to invade the Soviet Union. Any country that Hitler made a pact with, whether it be Poland or the Soviet Union, was sure to be invaded within a couple of years. And Stalin knew that they were going to move east, and he wanted the International Brigade. It was Dimitrov's idea, apparently in September of '36, and Stalin gave the okay, and they started recruiting in October. And a lot of people, Marshal Tito, who was Joseph Brot's, cut his teeth in Spain. And the idea, and I think Joe Norman says, he's asked at the end of his interview, I won't play it, he said, the interview at the Imperial War, he said, was it worth it? Was all of this worth it? And he says, I look at it this way. We slowed fascism down in Europe. We kept it bogged down for 3 years. And in a way, he's right, because Franco did not expect a civil war. Franco just thought it would be a transfer of power from the Cortes to the army, more or less overnight. And he was surprised. And there were two key things that slowed him down. One was the army of the trade unions by the Republic, and the second was the international brigades. They armed the people.
That's good.
Thank you, Michael. I think that's all
sir,
the
I just found your
questions.
article, actually.
Well, that's good. I think you should send it.
But one other thing, it just as a question in a general sense. So officially, Portugal was neutral.
Officially.
Officially. But we know very, very well that the Nazis like to vacation on the coast and funnel their gold ingots through Lisbon mostly. Do we know of the influence of the Portuguese government, or was that pretty much moot in terms of what was going on in Spain?
Pass. I'm sorry, I will get there. I will get there. But he doesn't actually, because I keep rereading Beaver, and Portugal doesn't get much of a mention. But Portugal was a dictatorship at the time, anyway, and that's for sure. It does not want the Republic to. I mean, people are understandably frightened of Bolshevism. And Britain's, well, the British really are frightened of it in the 1930s in Spain. Lenin goes to Barcelona in the 20s. But you know, I don't think a Soviet Spain was ever on the cards. I don't know really, but no, you wouldn't. Portugal, but it's kind of like Portugal is to the Spanish Civil War what Franco was to Hitler. Is an ally in all but name. But I don't know enough about it to commentate it in detail really.
Well, we have here actually not far from where I live near DC, we have captured records from, yeah, we have captured records, I think starting from 35 or 36 in our National Archives. So I can see what I can find.
You could, and keep in touch, Marcia. There's a question from Tony. Wasn't James Rutherford shot at San Pedro? He was, and I have Joe talking about that. So James Rutherford was captured, and then he was exchanged. This is before San Pedro, and sent back to Britain, and then he went back out to Spain again, which really, to be honest, was foolish, because if you were exchanged for a prisoner, and if you were caught in a country, a condition of your release was that you never set foot in Spain again. And so he was executed. And Joe, they gave him another name, and they tried to hide him, but the Germans spotted him, and so he was summarily executed. He was very young. Right, it's, where are we? 8:45. I think I probably would like to sort of sum up and end it there really. And thank you to everyone for listening, and for contributing as well, and saying nice things and asking questions on chat. And next week, actually, Heptonstall Historical, this is our first Zoom. We are pretty much a local historical society, but next week, so there's Ollie Robertshaw is talking about researching family history in Calderdale. In October, and this is a subject really for pretty much anyone from anywhere, is Nick Wilding and Anne Kilby are talking about Dawson City, which was an encampment of a substantial size up in the Pennines where migrant labour built the reservoirs in 1905. And I go up there with a metal detector. And it's an incredible story, really. And Nick and Anne have been researching this for many years. And then in November, we do have a website, and all this stuff is on there. In November, Linda Maynard is doing a talk about grief and the First World War, sibling grief in the aftermath of the First World War, and how individuals cope with this, and the huge psychological shock and emotional shock, really. And we tend to talk, when we talk about deaths in war, 20,000 here, 500,000 there, and all the rest of it, but each one is an individual life and part of a family or a relationship. And Linda studied this, and it's called, the talk is called, I Often Think About My Brother, Sibling Grief in the Aftermath of the First World War. So look out for us. And Jeff, I'll probably see you at the Working Class Movement Library. I'm there every week. And Marcia, thank you so much. And Mike's phone's dead, but I'm going to keep in touch with Mike Wild. Look, thank you to everyone. I hope you've been able to hear and see okay. And so feel free to leave. And adieu. And thank you for staying the course. And reading, go to Richard Baxell. I tell you what, the best memoir, forget Homage to Catalonia. Well, don't forget it. It's pretty good. It's George. But this is a book by Walter Gregory. It's called The Shallow Grave. I've read it a few times. And he was from Nottingham. And it's an IB. And it's very, very well written. Thanks a lot, guys. Take care.